A Massacre in Boston. Samuel Adams had a young cousin named John. "I have heard of one Mr. Adams," said King George to the Massachusetts governor, "but who is the other?" The other, honest, serious John Adams, would become even more famous than Sam. Sam was an agitator and an organizer who helped start a revolution. John was a farmer and a lawyer, a solid citizen who helped lead that revolution. Someone who knew John Adams said that he possessed more learning than anyone in the colonies. That may have been an exaggeration, but John had done a lot of reading and studying. He knew how to use his mind. Here's a story about both Adams' cousins. The story of the Boston Massacre. A massacre, as you may know, is a gruesome killing. That's what happened in Boston in 1770. The story begins in 1765 when the English Parliament passed a law that said American citizens had to provide quarters for British soldiers. The quarters that they were talking about are not the kind you get when you add 2 dimes and a nickel. Quarters can also be houses where soldiers live. The law was called the Quartering Act. English soldiers who were redcoats because of the color of their uniforms were to be quartered in American towns and cities. Well, the Americans didn't want British redcoats quartered in their towns or cities or even in their country. So when the soldiers arrived in 1768, the colonists weren't very kind to them. Sometimes they made fun of them, sometimes they threw snowballs or rocks, sometimes they called them lobsterbacks, or even worse names. The people in Boston were especially annoyed and at first wouldn't even provide quarters. So the soldiers set up tents on the Boston Common, a big grassy area in the center of town, and played their drums and bugles loudly at the most inappropriate times. Some of the English soldiers didn't want to be in America anyway. They were poorly paid, and many were homesick. Some ran away from the British Army. A few redcoats, especially the officers, were treated well. Some married American women. But for most of the British soldiers, the winters in Boston seemed longer and colder and more miserable than any they had ever known. On a freezing March day in 1770, one of the king's soldiers was looking for work to earn some extra money. Someone started making fun of him and told him to get a job cleaning toilets. Only they didn't have the kind of toilets we have today. They had outdoor privies, which were dirt-floored holes, and they smelled. One thing led to another, and there was a fight. That started things. Soon a noisy, jeering group of mischief makers gathered in front of Boston Custom House. They began pushing and shoving and throwing stones and pieces of ice at the British sentry. He got knocked down and he called for help. Captain Thomas Preston came to the rescue with 8 British soldiers. There is some confusion about what happened next. The mob is said to have taunted to the redcoats, yelling, "Fire! Fire!" Captain Preston is said to have yelled, "Hold your fire!" Then a British soldier was hit with a big stick. He claimed he heard the word fire, so he fired his gun into the crowd. The street gang moved forward. The redcoats panicked and fired at the unarmed people. 5 Americans died. 7 were wounded. None of them was a hero. The victims were troublemakers who got worse than they deserved. The soldiers were professionals. The British Army was supposed to be the best in the world, who shouldn't have panicked. The whole thing shouldn't have happened. Sam Adams made the most of it. He called it the Boston Massacre and had Paul Revere engrave a picture of the scene. Revere was a silversmith who made fine teapots and pitchers. He was also a dedicated patriot, a dentist, a printer, a good horseback rider, and a friend of Samuel Adams. The picture of Paul Revere chose to etch into a piece of copper so it could be printed over and over again, showed British soldiers firing at peaceful Boston citizens. That wasn't the way it actually happened. Adams and Revere knew that, but the draft made good propaganda. It made people furious at the British. That drawing was soon seen all over the colonies, and it helped start a war. There is one hero in the story of the Boston Massacre, John Adams. John didn't want British soldiers in Boston. He wanted freedom for his country. But he was fair, and he always did what he thought was right. And even though everyone in America wanted to blame the British soldiers, John Adams believed that they should have a fair trial. He knew they needed a good lawyer, and he was one of the best lawyers in the colonies. So he took the case of the redcoats. Adams argued that the soldiers had defended themselves against an angry mob. A Boston jury found 6 of the soldiers not guilty. 2 soldiers were found guilty of manslaughter, not murder. They were branded on their thumbs. Long after the American Revolution, someone asked John Adams what the war had been about. There were 2 revolutions, he explained. One was the war itself, but the most important revolution, he said, had occurred even before the war began. It had to do with the ideas and attitudes. Revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people, said John Adams. What do you think he meant by that? John Adams was fighting for more than just separation from England. He wanted a chance to form totally new kinds of government, a government based on fair play and self-government. Are people able to govern themselves? That question wasn't even being asked in most of the world. Always there were kings or priests or a ruling class. A country where people made their own laws? That sounded strange. Could the mass of people be trusted to choose their own leaders? It was a radical idea. Samuel and John Adams knew that people in the colonies had much experience in self-government. They believed Americans could run their own nation and elect their own leaders. The Adams cousins would convince others. They would help form an American republic. There was much to do before it all worked out. Plans had to be made. A Congress was needed. Samuel Adams' committees of correspondence were made up of leaders from all over the colonies. Those committees then became a Congress, the first Continental Congress. It was 1774 when the Congress met in Philadelphia, midway between New England and southern colonies. Philadelphia was America's leading city, so it made sense to meet there. Representatives came from every colony except Georgia. Samuel Adams and John Adams were both delegates. Sam wore a new wine red suit with gold buttons, a gift from a Boston craftsman who didn't want his representative to look shabby. Alexander McDougall and John Jay, who would later be a new nation's first Chief Justice, came from New York, determined to see that the colonies put pressure on England by not importing her goods. John Dickinson, who lived in Philadelphia, argued that a way must be found to get along with England. South Carolina's Christopher Gadsden and Virginia's Patrick Henry didn't agree with Dickinson. They were considered radicals. Arms are a resource to which we shall be forced, said the fiery Patrick Henry. When he said arms, he meant guns. The Congress soon advised the colonists to form an armed militia units and stop buying goods from England. Virginia's Peyton Randolph, a moderate, was elected president of the Congress. South Carolina's John Rutledge, whom you first met when he visited New York for the Stamp Act Congress, was another moderate. There is in the Congress a collection of the greatest men upon this continent, John Adams noted in his diary. The delegates of the Congress passed 10 resolutions listing in the rights of the colonists, including the right to life, liberty, and property. But perhaps the most important thing that happened was the colonial leaders got together and talked about their common problems. Then they wrote a polite, respectful petition and sent it to King George, urging him to consider their complaints. But George wouldn't even think about that. The delegates made plans to meet again if the situation in the country didn't improve. Things got worse.